Will the Federal Reserve's central bank digital currency create a massive amount of stagflation? Very similar to what we saw in the 1970s. The short answer, I believe, is yes. And I'm going to explain this to you in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go over how money is actually created, or how it was created in the past. And before we go any further, I want everyone to know that my blue marker isn't working today. So we're going to have to do the best with what we got with just 3 colors. But let's go over how money is typically created. It's really by the commercial banking system. Check this out. We've got 3 separate balance sheets. The balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, or any central bank. The banks, this represents the commercial banking system. And the average Joe. So we start with the assets of the Federal Reserve being treasuries. The liabilities are bank reserves. These liabilities are assets. They're the cash for the commercial banking system. So although I have them in different colors, these are the exact same thing. I just made it red over here because it's a liability and black over here because it is an asset. But let's say this is $100 billion worth of bank reserves. It's the exact same $100 billion of bank reserves as assets on the commercial banking system's balance sheet. So just to reiterate, because it's very important you understand this, the bank reserves are liabilities of the Fed, assets of the commercial bank. Now, the deposits in the commercial banking system are liabilities. They're basically saying, customer, we owe you this many dollars. And as most of you know from watching my videos, dollars in and of themselves are IOUs. So the banking system is saying, average Joe, we owe you IOUs. Gets very confusing, doesn't it? But this illustrates what Chris Cole always says, and he says it so well, that fiat currency is nothing more than a thought abstraction. But we'll save that for a separate video. So those deposit liabilities are assets of the average Joe. So if he has $100 in his bank, again, that's a liability of the bank, an asset of the average Joe. What you'll notice is that dollars, any dollars that exist, whether they're on the balance sheet of the banking system or the average Joe or an entity in the real economy, is nothing more than a liability of a bank. In the real economy, those dollars are liabilities of the commercial banks. In the financial economy, those dollars are liabilities of the Fed. So we'll assume for this first example that the average Joe has no debt. So the $100 asset, the liability would be equity. Equity is a liability on a balance sheet. Okay, so now let's move over to example number 2, where the bank actually gives a loan to the average Joe. The balance sheet for the Fed or the central bank doesn't change at all. The exact same amount of assets, in this case treasuries, the exact same $100 billion worth of bank reserves. But the balance sheet for the bank changes. Same amount of bank reserves, but now they have an additional asset in the form of the loan they just gave the average Joe. But they also have an equivalent liability because now Joe has an additional deposit. So his balance sheet now has 2 deposits. We'll say 2 $100 deposits, so $200 total. Has the same amount of equity, $100 bucks, but now he also has a loan where he owes the bank $100. But look at what has happened to the liability side of the commercial bank's balance sheet. It's increased by $200. Therefore, the actual money supply, or better said, the dollar supply in the real economy has increased by the bank creating the loan. So what this means, like we said at the beginning, is money, or dollars, better said, currency, is created by the commercial banking system, or at least it was. We're going to get into how it's done today and in the future in steps 2 and 3. The amount of dollars, therefore, also controlled by the commercial banking system. And if inflation is really a measurement of how many dollars are in the real economy chasing goods and services, we could also say inflation itself is largely controlled by the banksters and the commercial banking system. But to illustrate this even further, editor, let's go right to the internet.
This is a diagram from the Bank of England's 2014 paper titled Money Creation in the Modern Economy. And this shows us 2 bank balance sheets when there's a mortgage created. So the buyer is buying a home from the seller. So on the far left, we see the buyer's bank's balance sheet. And just to the right, it shows the seller's bank's balance sheet. And like we showed on the whiteboard, the reserves are on the left, deposits or liabilities of the bank on the right, indicated in red. So reserves, green, deposits, red. I got a little bit of currency there in blue. So what happens when the buyer gets a loan from their bank is that loan is now an asset on the bank's balance sheet, but they create new deposits, therefore new liabilities. And let's assume for a moment that the seller is banking with a different bank. So the buyer banks with Wells Fargo, the seller banks with Bank of America. So what would happen is the buyer would transfer the money to the seller's bank account at their bank. So then the balance sheets would change significantly. The seller's bank would now have an additional deposit or an additional liability. But the bank reserves would have to be transferred over to match up with that new liability. If the buyer's bank just transferred over the new deposits, then the seller's bank could potentially be insolvent because they wouldn't have the assets to match up with the liabilities that were just transferred over. So the bank reserves are transferred over to the seller's bank along with the new deposits. And let's remember, those are the dollars that the buyer paid the seller for the house. And those dollars, if we go back to this middle portion, those dollars are new deposits. Therefore, those dollars did not exist before. So through the process of creating this new mortgage, we created new dollars circulating in the real economy. But I want to point out that throughout this entire process of dollars being created by additional loans being created, the Federal Reserve and the government had nothing to do with it. All of these brand new dollars that were created were done so within complete control of the commercial banking system. So we like to think that the central banks are central to creating dollars, but they're not. What we've proven here and what we've shown is that Jerome Powell is not in control of the dollar. Jamie Dimon and the banksters are in control of the United States dollar and the amount of dollars that are in the system.
Step number 2. So we went over the traditional system of creating dollars in the real economy, but now everything has changed. And this is where you can start to see how we could get significant, potentially massive stagflation in the future. So in 2020, and this is where we have the Fed and the government step in and create insane amounts of dollars. And just to really prove my point before we get into this step, I want to pull up a chart of bank lending in 2020. And you'll notice that bank lending actually went down in 2020 during the cerveza sickness, or just after the cerveza sickness and after we got all of those PPP loans. So you would assume that the amount of dollars in the system measured by M2 money supply would also go down. But what we saw is the complete opposite. Editor, go ahead and throw up the chart of M2 money supply, where you'll notice that the amount of dollars in the system using this measurement increased by 25% in 2020 alone. Think about that. Just using broad numbers, prior to 2020, in the entire history of the United States, we had $15 trillion created. And in 2020 alone, there was almost another $5 trillion created out of thin air. The Fugazis, if you will. Editor, throw up that clip. That's everybody's favorite.
It's all a Fugazi. You know what a Fugazi is?
Well, Fugazi. It's a fake.
Yeah, Fugazi. It's a wazi, it's a woozy, it's a fairy dust. It doesn't exist. It's never landed. It is no matter. It's not on the elemental chart. It's not real.
So this begs the question, how on earth did we have the amount of dollars in the system go up to that degree while bank lending went down, if bank lending is the way dollars are created in the first place? This is how it happened. And this is why I'm calling it a kind of a hybrid system we have now. So the government comes in your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam, and he makes it rain down on the real economy, giving stimmy checks to everyone, the average Joe, Moody the millennial, who now today has red hair because my blue marker isn't working. So my apologies go out to Moody today. I know you usually like blue hair, but today it's got to be red. And then everybody's favorite from the streets of San Francisco, heroin guy, with his little needle right there, and who knows what's coming out. But the bottom line is your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam gives all these stimulus checks and other forms of stimulus that went out to the individuals and the entities in the real economy. Well, how do they get the money to do this? They have to sell treasuries. Usually, what would happen is the individuals and entities in the real economy, most likely not Moody or heroin guy, but maybe the average Joe, would buy those treasuries from Janet Yellen when she issues them at auction. So they would buy the debt. So they would give the money, if you will, or the dollars to the government, and then the government would spend those dollars and redistribute them back into the economy. So the main point here is when those treasuries are sold, they're sucking dollars out of the real economy, and then they're spending the same dollars right back in. So on net balance, we don't have an increase in that M2 money supply. It goes back to, the majority of it goes back to the commercial banking system as far as it going up or down. But now what's happening to a great degree is instead of the entities in the real economy buying those treasuries, the Fed is buying them through the shell game with the primary dealer banks. But essentially what happens, those treasuries go to the Fed, so now they're an asset on the Fed's balance sheet. And to pay for those treasuries, they credit the government's account, which is a liability of the Federal Reserve. They credit their account, the bank reserves, to pay for those treasuries. So let's just assume for a moment that they purchased $10,000 worth of treasuries. So now the government's account, the TGA, the Treasury General Account, has an additional $10,000 in it. Okay, well, they spend that $10,000 into the system, and then Joe, Moody, and heroin guy deposit the $10,000 into their bank. So this creates an additional $10,000 worth of deposits. Why? Because the money wasn't sucked out of the system to begin with. It was created by the Fed crediting the TGA with the $10,000 in bank reserves. But remember, going back to step number 1, the banking system can't take additional liabilities without getting additional assets. So what happens, and what I illustrated in this second balance sheet, although it's pretty much the exact same, here the $10,000 in bank reserves are held in the government's account. Again, the TGA. But when the stimmy checks go out and the individuals deposit those stimmy checks in the commercial banking system, those bank reserves are transferred from the government's account to the bank's account. So now they've got the assets to match up with those additional liabilities. One thing I'd like to point out, the Fed's balance sheet does not change at all. The only thing that happens is the bank reserves move from one account to the other account. And what has happened throughout this process is M2 money supply has increased. And the reason, I'll state it one more time to make sure we're all on the same page, is because the treasuries were purchased directly from the Fed by creating bank reserves instead of purchased by the individuals and entities in the real economy using existing dollars. So they're not sucking those dollars out of the system and spending them. They're creating new bank reserves and then spending brand new dollars into the system. So on net balance, the amount of dollars in the real economy increases, which is why you saw M2 money supply go up by 25% in 2020. To illustrate this further, let's go right back to the internet and check out some charts that are going to absolutely blow your mind.
We start by looking at the government's budget deficit for 2020. And I want to point out this is a projected deficit. I think the actual deficit, when everything was said and done, was closer to $5 trillion. But we'll give them the benefit of the doubt momentarily. We'll look at the glass half full on this one and just assume their deficit was $4.2 trillion. To put that into context, let's go back to the GFC, when they took unprecedented measures to spend more and more money to bail out the banks and to stimulate, quote unquote, stimulate the economy. Back during the GFC, the budget deficit for the government was $1.4 trillion. I also want to point out that going back to 2019, when supposedly we had the greatest economy of all time, unemployment rate was down near 3%. The economy was booming if you listen to CNBC or Bloomberg or any of the financial media. Yet somehow interest rates were still very, very close to zero. The Fed couldn't unwind their balance sheet, and the budget deficit for the government was still almost $1 trillion. And this is supposedly when we had this booming economy. That's why that's one of the reasons why I always use the example of heroin guy when I'm talking about the economy. Because obviously, when we look at the actual numbers, we see the underlying fundamentals of the economy are extremely unstable, regardless of what the headline numbers look like that we see in the financial media. But the bottom line is the deficit in 2020 goes up to $4.2 trillion. Now, if what we were saying on the whiteboard was true, that this was why M2 went up because the Fed was monetizing the debt, what you would also see, or need to see, is the Fed's balance sheet also going parabolic. Because remember, they're paying for these newly issued treasuries with bank reserves. They weren't sucking those dollars out of the system to begin with. So what we should see is the Fed's balance sheet going parabolic. So let's go to this next chart and we look at the yellow shaded area, and as most of you probably expected, the Fed's balance sheet went Buzz Lightyear to infinity and beyond.
To infinity and beyond!
So this shows us that increase in M2 money supply was really a result of the government deficit spending and the Fed monetizing the debt. One other thing that I'd really like to point out that's interesting, let's go back to that chart of M2 money supply. You see it pretty much goes up in a straight line, but the trajectory really doesn't change until we get to the cerveza sickness in 2020. Well, let's look at the Fed's balance sheet one more time. You'll notice there's no correlation whatsoever. In 2013, as an example, when the Fed's balance sheet was going parabolic, that line, M2 money supply growth, the trajectory really didn't change at all. And then in 2018, when the Fed started to reduce the size of their balance sheet through QT, or quantitative tightening, you notice that the M2 money supply line, or the trajectory of the line, was still very consistent. Nothing really changed until we got to the cerveza sickness, and you can see that the line for M2 money supply almost mirrors the line for the Fed's balance sheet. They're almost identical. And this again shows us that that increase in M2 money supply most likely was a result of the Fed increasing their money supply by creating fugazis, bank reserves, out of thin air to buy those treasuries directly from the government, and then the government spent the funny money into the economy. So now what we have is a hybrid system where the commercial banking system is creating and destroying dollars, but the Fed and the government are doing the exact same thing. So even if the amount of dollars being created by the commercial banking system is going down, the amount of dollars in the overall system can go up as long as your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam is spending enough money, and Jerome Powell is sitting there willingly buying almost every single treasury that Janet Yellen is issuing at those auctions. In other words, what this contrast between M2 money supply and the Fed's balance sheet shows us is prior to 2020, the banking system was really in control of the dollar. And after 2020, we moved to this hybrid system where it's not only the commercial banking system that's in charge of the amount of dollars being created, but it's also the Fed and the government.
Step number 3, the central bank digital currency stagflation endgame. And in case you are wondering, now is definitely the time to sit down and pour yourself that stiff drink because you're going to need it with this step for sure. We started off in step 1 by showing how the banking system in the past was usually responsible for creating the dollars through lending to the average Joe. Now we've gone into this hybrid system where it's the banks, the government, and the Fed. They are all creating these new dollars, and sometimes the banking system is creating less, and the Fed and the government have to create that much more to on net balance have an increase in the amount of dollars. And let's remember why they need more dollars. Why do they need inflation? Because the largest debtor in human history is none other than your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam. The only way to bail out the government and all of the debt they've accumulated is to create inflation so the government can pay back that debt with devalued, cheaper dollars. And I've explained that in several of my videos, so most of you watching this right now will understand exactly what I'm referring to. But it's always important that we remember why their end game or their goal, their objective is to create the inflation. But now I think we may move into a whole new system that we have never seen before with central bank digital currencies. In other words, Fed coin. So if we all have accounts with the Fed, let's say they make you download or they suggest that you download their app. And like Ron Paul has always pointed out, whenever the government gives a program or a law a name, you can guarantee it does the exact opposite of the name they give it. So let's just say this app they'll have everyone download is called the Freedom app. And that's how you would get your universal basic income, or however they incentivize the average Joe, Moody, and heroin guy, the individuals in the real economy that aren't watching my videos. That's how they'd incentivize them to download that app. Now, if you download the app, that automatically gives you an account with the Fed. Just like right now, you have an account with your bank. Well, if you have an account with the Fed, that means they can lend directly to you. So those bank reserves that they create, that they can create out of thin air, the fugazis, that used to be assets of the commercial banks, now would be assets of not only the commercial banks, if they were even still around, they would be assets of the individuals and entities in the real economy. So what I'm saying is, instead of going to your local bank to get a mortgage, let's say Wells Fargo, Chase, or Bank of America, you would instead go directly to Jerome Powell. Now, why this is so important, why this is such a huge paradigm shift, if you're getting your next auto loan from Jerome Powell, is because the banking system is constrained. They have a profit and loss. They are incentivized to lend to individuals and entities that can actually pay them back. Makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? But the Fed doesn't have these constraints. If they issue a loan to the average Joe or to Moody the millennial, it doesn't really matter if the Fed gets paid back, because they don't really have to worry about a P&L, and they could possibly have even negative equity, and it might not matter. So they don't have these constraints. So what would that allow them to do? That would allow them to target lending to whatever groups or individuals were favored by the government or the specific politicians. It would also allow them to give everyone an individual interest rate. It would basically be monetary policy, not just for the entire country or the entire economy or society at large, but for each individual in the economy. They could each have a different interest rate based on what? Well, if they don't have the constraints to be paid back, they could issue the interest rate or the amount of lending based on not only who has political favor, but also who has the best social score. And we see the Chinese going down this path, and I think there's a decent probability that the United States will go there as well in the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, especially if we move to this central bank digital currency. Now, how does this apply to stagflation specifically? Well, let's think this through. If the loans that are being created and going out into the real economy are no longer based on increasing productivity, like they should be by the banking system, we're going to have huge economic distortions, malinvestment, and misallocations of resources. So let's remember how we define wealth. You guys know from watching my channel, it has nothing to do with the amount of dollars or currency. Really has nothing to do with the amount of gold or even Bitcoin or silver. It has to do with the amount of goods and services an economy can produce efficiently. That is wealth. So if we have these economic distortions, we will have less stuff actually being created by the private sector and the real economy. But as you can imagine, we will have far more dollars being created because the Fed has to bail out the government by creating inflation. So we have this mo money type situation going back to the best comedy show of all time in living color. Editor, go ahead and throw up the clip.
More money, more money, more money.
But if we have less stuff being produced and more money, then we have higher rates of consumer prices. This takes us to the inflation part of stagflation. But remember, to get to stagflation, we also need high rates of unemployment. And usually this is what we would have with these economic distortions created by the Fed taking over the lending process instead of the commercial banks that had the constraints we were talking about earlier. But when I was thinking this through on my own, I actually came to a different conclusion. We might have something that resembles stagflation or is effectively the same thing, but it could be high rates of inflation with very, very low rates of unemployment. Why? Because you guys know as well as I do, one of the popular buzzwords right now with the politicians and policymakers, the central planners, is MMT. And one of the basic principles of MMT is a jobs guarantee program. So I think we may see in the future, along with everything else, that the government or the Fed comes in and guarantees everyone a job. The problem is these jobs will not be productive. They will be unproductive and create further economic distortions. So as a society, we continue to get poorer. Our standard of living goes down just like it did in the 1970s, but we might have low rates of unemployment. It's just that we would have very high rates of unproductive jobs. But let me be very clear. There are only probabilities. There are no certainties whatsoever. I'm just saying that I think the probability is high that the government and the Fed will try to pull something like this off. Why? Because it's the only way out for the government and all the profligate spending we have had over the past decades. But whether or not they'll be able to achieve their objectives is a completely separate question.
For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.